tonight's story, which is the Banshees Comb, part 2. And if you happen to miss part 1, don't worry about it. I'll have you caught up in like 30 seconds. Really. But if you feel like you still got left out, you can go watch part 1 on the YouTube link after this story, because you want to listen to this one now, right? Yeah. Anyway, this is Darby O'Gill and the Banshees Comb, also known as the Banshees Halloween. Click. There. Sometimes you have to reinforce those clicks. There we go. As we mentioned last night, this is the same Darby of Disney fame, but it is not the story in the movie. The movie draws on numerous of the Darby O'Gill stories written by Hermione Cavanaugh, and of which his brief encounter with the Banshee in the movie is just one of them. In this story, Darby finds the end of part of a comb. Yep, a whole comb, like for brushing your hair with, that later turns out to belong to the Banshee. In her attempts to locate the missing piece of that comb, the Phantom Woman summons up a host of ghosts from the graveyard to sweep through the countryside and towns looking for it. And if you want to know how Darby O'Gill escapes, well, hey, stick around. If you'd like to read along, because it is in the vernacular, which is a little weird to listen to, and I'm going to do my best to maintain authenticity and yet still be, able to be understood. However, if you'd like to read along, there's a link there in local chat, and we're beginning on page 240 tonight. Tonight's story is just a bit long, but not quite as long as part 1. So, depending how fast I talk, we should wrap up by 8:15 or so. So, on with the story, yeah. When we last met, 'twas Halloween night, and Darby O'Gill had gone out in a tremendous storm to take a bit of black tea to Eileen McCarthy's house to help comfort her in her final dying hours. Despite his professed opinions against meddling or moiling in the affairs of fairies, Darby got himself tangled up with the Banshee that stormy night and found her comb laying on the ground, and now the Banshee cannot conduct her business of wailing for dying souls unless she's combing her hair while she does it. So she demanded Darby return that comb to her. In return, Darby, knowledgeable man that he is, demanded his 3 rightful wishes before returning it to her. First and foremost, he wished, I want you never to put your spell on any of me or my kith or kin. And my second wish, says the knowledgeable man, my second wish is that the black spell be taken from Eileen McCarthy. And so Eileen escaped certain immediate death. And thirdly, I want me briar pipe back. Now, for a little while after Darby O'Gill sent the Banshee back her comb, well, there was duckins to pay in that townland. Each night came stormier than the others. And the rain, never since Noe the Phoenician hoisted sail for Ariat was there promised such a denudering flood. In one way or another, we're all, even the German men and the Far Downs, descendants of the Phoenicians, aren't we? Even at that, the foul weather was the least of the troubles. The countryside road was haunted. The entire countryside was haunted. And every ghost must have left Crogmaw as soon as twilight to wander abroad in the lonesome places. The farmyards and even the village itself was not safe in those stormy days and nights. One morning, just before cockcrow, big Joey Hooligan, the smith, woke up and with a sudden terrible feeling that some ghastly person was a-looking at him through the window. And starting up and flurried in bed, what did he see but 2 eyes that were burning like coals of fire and peering steady into the room? One glance was enough. Giving a tremendous gasp, Joey dropped back quaking into the bed and covered his head with the bedclothes. How long after that the 2 hideous eyes kept staring at the bed, Joey can't rightly tell, for he never uncovered his head nor stirred hand nor foot again till his wife, Nancy, had lighted the fire and boiled the stirabout. Now, indeed, though it was a good month after that before Joey found courage enough to get up first in the morning so as to light the fire. And on that same memorable morning, he and Nancy lay in bed argufying about it till nearly noon. The poor man was that frightened. Now, that evening, after Hooligan was visited, Mrs. Nora Clancy was in the stable milking her cow, Cornelia by name, when sudden she spied a tall and strange man in a topcoat standing near the stable door, and he with his back turned towards her. At first she thought it was a shadow, but it appeared a trifle thicker than a shadow, and so little feared he called out, God save you, kind sir. At that the shadow turned a dim grey face toward her, so full of reproachful woe that Mrs. Clancy let a screech out of her and tumbled over the pail of milk betwixt her knees. She lay on her back in the spilt milk unconscionable for a full 15 minutes. And no, I don't think she was crying, even though she did spill the milk, because, she was unconscious. Now, the next night, a very reliable thinker, take that back, Freudian slip, that is, a very reliable tinker, who is not indeed a great thinker, a tinker named Bothered Bill Donahue, while wandering near the Charter's ruined mill, came quite accidental upon 20 skeletons. And they were colloquial and confabbing together on the flat roof of the mill shed. But worst of all, and something that struck deep terror into every heart, was the news that 6 different persons at 6 different places had met with the terrible phantom coach, the Coast of Bower. Now, Peggy Collins, a wandering beggar woman from the West Country, had a wild chase for it, as if she'd been a second later reaching the chapel steps and laying her hand on the church door. Well, Peggy would have had Peggy for sure, I'm saying. Now, things got on so that after dark, people only ventured out in couples or in crowds, and in pint of a piety that the parish was growing into an example of and patron for the nation, despite the sogginess of the lands thereabout. But all of the persons whom them conditions complicated, you may be sure the worst harried and implicated was the knowledgeable man, Darby O'Gill. Now, there was a weight on poor Darby's mind, and he couldn't tell why, and a dread in his heart that had no reasonable foundation. He moped and he mothered. Some of the time he felt like singing doleful ballads and death keens, and just the time he could hardly keep from crying. His appetite left him, but what confused him worse than all the rest was the fondness that had come over him for hard work, cutting turf and digging potatoes and things like that. The hard work that Darby is just not generally prone to. Now, to make matters even more unsociable, Darby's friend Brian Connors, the king of the fairies, hadn't showed a nose inside Darby's door for more than a fortnight, and so the knowledgeable man had no one to advise with. In them dismal circumstances, Darby's growing desperate, harnessed the poor Cleopatra one morning and drove up to Clonmel to see the master doctor. The renowned the renowned McNamara. Be this, you may know how bad he felt for no one till he was almost a pint of distillation ever went to see that crass, browbeaten old codger. So loath enough was our hero to face him, and hard-hearted enough was the welcome the crabbed little doctor held out to Darby when they met. "Me, what'd you eat for breakfast?" the physician says, peering savage from under his great eyebrows at Darby's tongue. "Oh, only a bowl of stir about. Well, a couple of potatoes, and a bit of bacon, and a few eggs." And he was counting on his fingers, and something or other I forgot. And another thing, too. Do you think I'll go into decline, Dr. Agra? Was all the comfort the sick man got from the blinking old blackguard. But turning immediate to his medicine table, the surgeon began studying the medicines. Now, there was so much of it ferninst him, he might have given a gallon and never missed it. Now, there was one fine big red bottle in particular that Darby had his eye on, and he thought his dose had surely come out of that. But McNamara turns to a box the size of your hat, and it filled to the top with little white pills. Well, the stingy old rascal counts out 3 and handed them to Darby, says, "Yeah, you take one before breakfast, another before dinner, and the last one before supper. And you give me 4 silver shillings, and that'll cure ye," says McNamara, says he. Now, you may be sure that Darby biled up inside with the madness of the unreasonableness of the price of the pills, but holding himself in, he says very cool and quiet, "Will you write me out a receipt for the money then, Dr. McNamara, if you please?" Darby says. And whilst the old chater was, turned to the writing, be the hokey if our hero did not half fill his pockets with pills from that box. And by means of those pills, as he drove along home, he was able to do a power of good to the neighbour people he met with on the road. Now, when you once get in the habit of it, there's no pleasure in life which equals giving other people medicine. Darby generously made old Peggy Callahan take 6 of the little round things. He gave a swallow to half-witted Red Durgan and a good mouthful to poor sick Eileen McCarthy, only she had to gulp them whole, poor thing, and couldn't eat them as the others did, but maybe 'twas just as good. And he gave a fistful each to Judy Rafferty and Dennis Hogan, and he stood handsome thrate to a stranger who, the minute he got the taste well into his mouth, he wanted to fight Darby. Howsomever, the two only called each other hard names for a while, and Darby jogged along, doing good and growing lighter-hearted and merrier-minded at every stop he made. It was this way with Darby till just in front of Mrs. Kilcannon's. Who should Darby see scratching himself against the wall but Solomon, and the beast looking bitter, denunciation out of the corner of his eye. Darby turned his head, ashamed to look the mistreated donkey in the face. And worse still than that, just beyond Solomon, leaning against the same wall, was Bother Bill Donahue, the deaf tinker. That last sight dashed Darby entirely, for he knew as well as if he had been told that the tinker was laying wait to ride home with him for a night's lodging. Now, it wasn't that Darby objected on his own account to taking him home, for a tinker, a beggar man, mind you, has a right the world over to claim a night's lodging and a bit to eat wherever he goes, and well, these honest people pay for it, don't they? And the gossip and the news they furnish at the fireside, and a good report of the family that they'll spread through the country afterwards. An itinerant storyteller is one of this clan, isn't he? Anyway, Darby liked well to have them come, but through some unknown weakness in character, Darby's darling Bridget hated the sight of them. Worst of all, Bridget hated Bother Bill. She was okay with Osnana. In fact, I think she liked Osnana. But Bother Bill, she flat out hated Bother Bill. She even went so far as to say that Bill was not half so bothered as he pretended, and that he could hear well enough that what was agreeable for him to hear, and that he was deaf only when he did like to listen to. Well, anyhow, there was a tinker in the road waiting for the cart to come up, and for a while what to do Darby didn't well know. He couldn't refuse one who asked food to eat or shelter for a wanderer's 4 bones during the night. That would be a sin, wouldn't it? Beside to bring bad luck upon the house. And still he had a mortal dislike to go against Bridget in this particular, so surely she'd blame Darby for bringing Bother Bill home. By a bit of length then, at last Darby decided with a sigh to put the whole case before Bill and let him come or stay. And so, whilst he was meditating on some way of conveying the news that they'd be complimentary to the tinker, and then they'd elevate instead of smashing the traveller's sensitiveness, Bill came up to the cart. "Top of the day to you, decent man," he says. "'Tis getting toward dark, and I'll get going home with you tonight, I think, yes." The tinker, like most people who are hard of hearing, roared as though the listener was bothered himself. Darby laid down the lines and hilt out a handful of the little reticence. "Well, there's nothing the matter with me. Why should I eat them?" cried Bill. "They're the best thing in the world for that," says Darby, forcing them into Bill's mouth. You don't know when you'll need 'em," he says, shouting. "It's better to meet sickness halfway," he says, "than to wait till it finds you." And then, whilst Bill, with an open hand against his ear, was chawing the pills and looking up plaintive into Darby's face, the knowledgeable man went on in a blandishing way to point out the situation. "So, you see, 'tis this way, Willum," he says. "It's only too delighted I'd be to take you home with me. Indeed, Bridget herself has wonderful admiration for you in the ordinary way. She believes you're a remarkable man entirely. Only she thinks you're not clean." The tinker must have misunderstood altogether, for he bawled in reply, You wish her good luck to her, then, and ain't I glad to have so fine an opinion from so fine a woman. But sure, all the women notice how tidy I am, and that's why they like to have me in the house. But we best be moving now," says he, coolly dropping his bags of tools into the Darby's cart, "for the night's at hand, and a black and stormy one it'll be," says Bill. He put a foot on the wheel of the cart, and as he did so, Darby, growing very red in the face, pressed a shilling into the tinker's hand. "Go into Mrs. Kilcannon's for the night, Willum, and come to us for your breakfast and your dinner, maybe your supper, me good fellow," says he. But the deaf man only pocketed the shilling and clambered up onto the seat beside Darby. "Oh, faith, the shilling's welcome, yeah. But I'd go to such commodious house as yours any time, Darby O'Gill, without you paying me, he says, patting Darby kindly on the back. But Darby's jaw was hanging for the loss of the shilling right on top of the unwelcome visitor. We'd better hurry, says the tinker, lighting his pipe. For after sundown, who knows what'll catch up with us on the road. Well, sure, there was nothing for it but to make the best of a bad bargain, and the two went on together, Darby gloomy and vexed, and the deaf man solemn but comfortable till they were almost at McHale's bridge. Then the tinker spoke up. See, did you hear the black threats Sheila Maguire's making against you, Darby? No, says Darby. What in the world ails Sheila Maguire against me? Bless the one of me knows, says the tinker, nor anybody else for that matter, Darby. Only that last Halloween night, Sheila Maguire was beat black and blue from head to foot, and she lays that responsibility on you, Darby O'Gill. Now the knowledgeable man had his mouth open for a question when who should go running across the road in front of them but Neddy McHale himself and his armful of sticks. Go back, go back, go back, cries Neddy, waving an arm wild. The bridge of Butterworks are bashed out by the flood, and McDonald's bridge is down too, so you must go round by the mill, says Neddy. Now, here was bitter news for you. 'Twas 2 miles out of the way to be going to Charter's Mill, and to do the best possible they'd pass on that haunted place in the pitch dark. Now, faith, I've had worse luck than in picking you up this night-bothered Bill, Donahue, says Darby, for it's a loath I'd be good to go alone past Charter's Mill, so I'm glad to have you with me, Bill. He turned to speak just in time, for this. The tinker gathered up his bag and put his right foot on the cartwheel, preparing for a jump. Darby clutched the lad by the back of his neck and jolted him back hard into the seat. You sit still there, Willum, till we reach my own house, Averneen, for if you try that move again, I'll not leave a whole bone of your body. Never let it be said, Darby says all lofty-like, that I turned one away who asks for a night's lodging from my door. And as Darby spoke, he wheeled the cart quick round in the road. You love me down, Mr. O'Gill. I think I'll stop the night with Neddy McHale, says Willum, shiverin. Bridget don't think I'm clean, he says, as the pony started off. Well, who told you that, I'd like to know, Darby shouted, growing fierce. Who dared say that of you? You're bothered, Willum, you know, and so you must interpret language. But Bill only cowered down sulky, and the pony galloped down the side lane into the words and striving to beat the rain in the darkness. But the elements were too swift-footed, weren't they? And the rain came down, and the shadows met together, and the dusk whirled quick until the blackness before they reached the gloomy mill. Ever and always Charter's Mill was a misfortunate place. It broke the heart of and ruined and killed the man who built it, and itself was a ruin these last 20 years. Not many was the wild tale known through the countryside of the things that had been seen and heard at Charter's Mill. But the tale that kept Darby and the tinker unwelcome company as the pony trotted along was what had happened here a couple of years before. One night, as Paddy Keller was driving past the gloomy old place, his best ear cocked and his weather eye open for ghosts, there came sudden from the mill 3 agonized shrieks for help. Thinking 'twas the spirits that were in it, Paddy whipped up his pony and hurried on his way, but the next morning, misdoubting whether 'twasn't a human voice after all he had heard, Paddy gathered up a dozen of the neighbours and went back to investigate. And what did they find in one of the upper rooms but a peddler, lying flat on the floor, his pack ramsacked, as he dead as a doornail. Now, what's to be particularly considered dead about that particular piece of ironmongery, I'm not sure. But there he was, dead as a doornail. 'Twas his cries Paddy had heard that the poor traveller was being murdered. Now, since that time, a dozen people passing the mill at night had heard the cries of the same peddler, and had seen the same place blazing with lights, so that now no one who could help it ever crossed alone next the mill after dark. At the hill this side of that place, the pony slowed down to a walk, and neither coaxing nor beating could induce the beast to mend his steps. The horse would stop a little and wait, and then it'd go on and trembling, and they could all see in the dim outlines the empty mill glowering up at them, and nearer them they came, the more it glowered, and the faster the 2 hearts beat. Halfway down the hill, an old signpost pointed the way with its broken arm, just beyond that bridge, and after that long level road, and salvation if they'd make it that far. But at the signpost, Cleopatra stopped dead still, stared into some bushes just beyond. She was shaking and snorting, and her limbs were trembling. At the same time, to tell the truth, she was no worse off than the two Christians sitting in the cart behind her, only they were not so demonstrative about it. Small blame to the lads at that, for they were sure and certain that lurking in the black shadows was a thing waiting to freeze their hearts in terror, and maybe to put a mark on them if they'd carry to their graves. After coaxing Cleopatra and reasoning with her in vain, Darby, his knees a knock, and turned to the tinker, and in the excitement of the events forgetting that Bill was deaf, he whispered, as cool and easy like as he could, "Hey, would you mind doing me the favour of stepping out a Vic and seeing what's in that road ahead of us, Willem?" But bothered Bill answered back as once, just as cool and easy, "I would mind, Darby, and I wouldn't get down a store to save your and your family and all their lineal descendants from the gallows rope," says he. "I thought you was deaf," says Darby, growing respectful. Disrespectful, that is. "Now, this is no time for explanations," says Willem. "And I thought myself," he went on, turning his shoulder at Darby, "that I was in the company with a brave man, but I'm sorry to find that I'm riding with no better than an outrageous coward," he says, bitter. Whilst Willem was saying them vexatious words, Darby stood leaning out of the cart with a hand on Cleopatra's back and a foot on the shaft and goggling his eyes and striving to pierce the darkness at the pony's head. Without turning round, he made answer. "Well, is that the way with it is with you then, Willem?" he says, still sarcastic. "Faix, then, you'll have that complete no longer. If yous don't climb down this minute, I'll throw you and your baggage in the ditch. So get out immediate, darling, or I'll throw you out," he says. Yeah, the words weren't well out of Darby's mouth when the audacious tinker whipped out his scissors and sent the sharp point of half an inch into Cleopatra's flank. Cleopatra jumped, and Darby, legs and arms a-flying, took a back somersault that he never equalled in his supplest days, for it landed him flat against the hedge, and the leap Cleopatra gave, if she could only keep it up, fitter for the Curragh races, and keep it up for a surprising while she did. At any rate, for as the knowledgeable man scrambled to his feet, he could hear her furious gallop 100 yards down the road. Stop her, Willem of Erneen. I was only joking. Come back, you shameless rogue of the universe. I'll have you transported," Darby shouted, rushing a few steps after them. But the lash of the whip on Cleopatra's sides was the only answer Willem sent back to him. To pursue was useless, and so the deserted man slacked down to a trot. Now I'd hate bad to have befall me any one of the 100 things Darby wished aloud then and there for Willem. Well, at all events, there was Darby, his head bent, plodding along through the storm, and fiercer storm than any wind or rain ever met, again raging in his heart. Only through that storm in his mind there flared now thin quivers of fear and trepidation that sometimes hastened his steps, and then again sometimes they faltered him. Howsoever, taking it all in, he was making good progress, and had got to a bunch of willows at the near side of the mill, when one particular remembrance of Sheila Maguire and of the Banshee's comb halted the lad in the middle of the road and sent him fumbling with nervous hands in his waistcoat pocket. And there, sure enough, was the piece of the Banshee's comb. Now the broken bit had lain forgotten in the lad's pocket since Halloween, and now as he felt it there next his thumping heart and buried under a pipeful of tobacco, the realization almost floored him with consternation, and all rushed over Darby's soul like a flood. Who else could it be but the Banshees that gave Sheila Maguire that terrible beating mentioned by the tinker? And what was that beating for, unless the Banshee accused Sheila of stealing the end of the comb? Oh, Mother of Moses, 'twas searching for that same bit of comb it was that brought up the ghosts and the storms from Croagh and made the whole townland haunted. Ah, well, was there ever such a dangerous predicament? Here Darby was, with ghosts in the trees above him and in the hedges, and maybe looking over his shoulder, and all of them, mind you, searching for the bit of the enchanted comb that was in his own pocket. If they should find out where it lay, what awful things they would be doing to Darby. Sure, they might call up the coast of Bower and fling him into it, and that'd be the last ever heard of Darby O'Gill in the land of the living. With them wild thoughts jumping up and down in his mind, Darby stood in the dark and in the rain and the flashing lightning and gloaming vacant over toward the shadowy ruin. And he, being much agitated, the lad, without thinking, did the foolishest thing a man in his situation could well accomplish. He took out of his pocket the enchanted sliver of gold and held it to his two eyes for a look. The consequences came sudden. Or as Darby stuck it back into the tobacco, there burst from the darkness of the willows the hollowest, most blood-curdling laugh that ever fell on mortal ears. The knowledgeable man's hair lifted to the hat from his head, and as if the laugh wasn't enough to scatter the wits of everyone, at the same instant it sounded, and quick as a flash, every window in the old mill blazed with a fierce blue light, every battered crack and crevice seemed bursting with a glare for maybe the space of 10 seconds, and then, oh, Amelia murder, there broke from the upper floor three of the bitterest shrieks of pain and terror ever heard in the world, and with the last cry the mill quenched itself in the darkness again and stood lonely and gloomy and silent as before. The rain pattered down, and the wind swished in the mournful trees, and there was no other sound. The knowledgeable man turned to creep away very soft and quiet, but as he did, a monstrous black thing that looked like a dog without a head crawled slowly out from the willows where the terrible laugh had come from, and it crept into the gloom of the opposite hedge, and there it stood waiting for Darby to draw near. But the knowledgeable man gave a leap backwards, and as he did, from the darkness just behind him swelled up a deep sigh that was almost a groan. From the hedge to his right came another sigh, and only deeper than the first, and from the blackness on his left rose another moan, and then groaning, moaning choruses rose all about old Darby, and lost himself in the wailing of the wind, and he was surrounded. Aye, the ghosts had captured Darby O'Gill. Now the lad never realized before that minute what a precious thing is daylight. If there would only come a flash of lightning to show him the faces of the surrounding spirits, horrible though they might be, he'd bid it welcome. But though the rain drizzled and the thunder rumbled, not a flare lit up the sky. One swift, desperate hope at the last minute saved the boy from sheer despair, and that same hope was that maybe some of the good people might be flying about and would hear him. So lifting up his face to the sky and crying out to a passing wind, he says, "Boys, hi, lads," says he, If there be any of yez to listen, I'll take it as a great favour, and I'll thank you kindly to tell King Brian Connors that his friend and comrade Darby O'Gill is in deep trouble and wants to see him immediate. Oh, lads, I hope you can hear me." Laughed the terrible thing in the hedge. Now, in spite of that laugh, he was almost sure that off in the distance a wee cry answered him. So to make sure, he called again, but this time, though he strained his ears till their drums ached, he caught no reply. And now, out of the murkiness in the road ahead of him, something began to grow slowly into a tall, slender white figure. Motionless it stood, tightly wrapped in a winding sheet. In his presence, a new and awful fear pressed down the heart of Darby. He felt, too, that another shade had taken its place behind him and didn't want to look, and he strove against looking, but something forced the lad to turn his head, and there, sure enough, not 5 feet away, stood as still and silent the tall, dark figure of a man in a topcoat. Then came from every direction low, hissing whispers that the lad couldn't understand. And something terrible would happen in a minute. Oh, Darby knew that well. Something terrible was about to happen. Now, there's just so much fear in every man, just exactly as there is a certain amount of courage, and when this fear is all spilt, a man either fights or dies. At least, so Darby had always said. And he remembered there was a gap in the hedge nearly opposite the clump of willows, so he made up his mind that come what might, he'd make a grand charge for it, and so into the upland meadow beyond. Darby waited for an instant to get some strength back into his knees, and then he gave a spring. But that one spring was all he made. Well, in that direction at least. For as he neared the ditch, a dozen white, ghostly hands reached out eager for him. With a gasp, he whirled in the thrucks and rushed and mad to the willows opposite, and there 100 ghastly fingers were stretched out to meet the poor lad. And as he staggered back into the middle of the road again, the hero couldn't say to save his soul, keep back a long cry of terror and distress. Immediate, from under the willows and from the niche near the hedge and in the air above his head from the Countess' dead lips echoed the triumphant, unearthly laugh. 'Twas then Darby just nearly gave up for roast. He felt his eyes growing dim and his limbs going numb, and there was no air coming into his lungs, and he wished for an RT, for when he tried to breathe he only gaped, and so that he knew the black spell was upon him, and that all that was left for him to do was to sink down into the road and then to die. Aye. But at that minute there floated from a great way off the faint cry of a voice the despairing man knew well. "Oh, you keep up your heart, Darby O'Gill!" cried Brian Connors. "We're coming to rescue ye!" And from over the fields a wild cheer followed in words. "Oh, fa la 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 la, clear the way, clear the way!" sprang the shrill cry of 1,000 of the good people. At the first sound of the king's words, there arose about Darby the mighty flurrying and rushing of wings in the darkness, as if tremendous birds were rising up sudden and flying away, and the air emptied itself of a smothering heaviness. And so fast came the king's fairy army that the great cheer was still echoing among the trees when the gold crown of Brian Connors sparkled up from beside the knowledgeable man's knees, and at that the persecuted man, sobbing with joy, knelt down the muddy road to shake hands with his friend, the master of the good people. Now Brian Connors was not alone, no, for there crowded about Darby, sympathizing with him, little Phelim Beg, and Neil the fiddler, and Shaun Rue the smith, and Fedric Og. Also every instant, flittering out of the sky into the road, came by the score green-cloaked and red-hooded men following the king and ready for trouble. "Oh, if ever a man needed a drop of good whiskey, you're the hero, ho-ho! And this is the time and place for it," says the king, handing up a silver-topped noggin. "You drink it all, my good man," he says, "and then we'll escort you home, Darby. Come on, Darby," says he. And the master of the night time turned and shouted to his subjects, "Boys, we'll go visible now for the better of the company's sake, eh? And do you make the illumination so Darby can see yous with him." I thought the lovely rosy light which, as you may remember, our hero first saw in the fairies' home at Slieve Manon back in the day, lighted up the roadway, and under the leafy arches, bobbing along like a regiment of soldiers, all in their green cloaks and red caps, marched at least 1,000 of the little people, with Fadric Og at their head, acting as a general. And as they passed the mill, 5 defiant pipers made the battered old windies rattle with Gary Owen. What was the rescue? But brings us to chapter 4, the coast of Bower. Aye. And so the green-dressed little army, all in the sweet rosy light they made, went marching to the merry music of the pipes over the tree-bowered roadway, past the haunted brakes, up the shivering hills, and down into the waiting dales, making the grim night melodious. And for a long space, not a word, good or bad, or indifferent, said Darby. But a sparrow woke her drowsy children to take a look at the beautiful procession, and a robin called excited to her sleeping neighbours, and the linnets and the hares and the rabbits and the hundreds of the like all crowded about, and the daylighted through the bushes and stood peering through the glistening leaves as their well-known companions went by. A dozen venturesome young owls flew from bough to bough, following along, cracking good-natured friendly jokes at their friends and fairies. Then other birds came flying from miles around, twittering jubilation. But the stern-jawed, frowny-eyed little people for once answered back never a word, but marched as stiff and silent as soldiers should. You'd swear 'twas the Enniskillens or the 18 Hussars that was in it. "Hey, ooh, isn't that General Julius Caesar at the head? Ooh," says one brown owl, flapping out an audacious wing at Fadric Og. "Who? Who? Julius Caesar, who? No, no," cries his brother, another young villain. "'Tis only the Duke of Wellington. But look at the bothered face and Darby O'Gill. Ooh, whoosh, are the good people going to hang Darby? Ooh." In faith, then, sure enough, there was a mighty little elevation on the features of our hero. For as he came marching alongside of the moody beside the king, what to do with the Banshee's comb was bothering the heart right out of Darby. And if he had only thrown it to the ghost when he was there at the mill, that terrible laugh had crunched all sense and reason out of the boy, and so that he forgot to do that very wise thing. Oh, Cohen, and now the ghost knew that Darby had it, and so to throw it away would do no good unless they'd find it after. One thing was certain, He must some way get it back to the Banshee or else be hunted all the rest of his days, himself and the parish around. He was sore-hearted, too, at the king, and a bit crass-tempered because the little man had stayed away so long from visiting him. But at last the knowledgeable man found his tongue. Yeah, be my faith, king, he complained. 'Tis a cure for sure eyes to see you, it is, and I might have been dead and buried and you none the wiser, says he all sulky-like. Oh, sure, I've been out to the country a fortnight, says the king, and I've only returned within the hour. I went on a sudden call to prevent a terrible war betwixt the French fairies and the German fairies, and I've been 2 weeks on an island in the River Ryan, betwixt France and Germany, don't you know? The river is called after an Irishman by the name of Ryan. Aye, well, at least you might have sent me word, says Darby. Oh, I didn't think I'd be gone so long, good man, says the fairy. But the disputation was tremendous, he says. And the little man drew himself up all dignified and scowled solemn at Darby. They left it for me to decide, and this was the contention. 50 years ago, a swan belonging to the French fairies laid a set of eggs on that same island, and then comes along a German swan, and what does the impotent creature do but set herself down on the eggs laid by the French swan and hatch them? After that, the hatching, the German men claimed the young ones, but the Frenchmen peremptorily demanded them back, do you mind? And the German men defied them, do you see? So, of course, the trouble started. For 50 years it's been growing, and before fighting as a last resort, they sent for me. Well, I saw at once what at the bottom of the ore was the old question which has been disturbing the world and driving people crazy for 3,000 years, eh? Ah, yes, I know, says Darby scornful. 'Twas whether the hen that laid the egg or the hen that hatched the egg, the mother of the chicken. Oh, hey, you are a knowledgeable man. Yes, nothing else but that. Now, what do you think I decided? He says. Well, now, Your Honour, I'll always blame Darby for not listening to the king's decision, because 'tis a matter I've studied myself considerable and never could rightly conclude. But Darby, at the time, was so bothered he only said in reply to the king, Well, sure, little I know, or sorrow little I care, Darby says sulky. I've got something more important than hen's eggs troubling me mind, and maybe you can help me, king, dear, he says, anxious. Hurrah, out with it then, man, says the king. And we'll find a way, Avernine, he says, cheerful. With that, Darby up and told everything that had happened Halloween night since, and indeed be saying, now there's you see now, well, here's this broken piece of comb in my pocket, and what to do with it I don't know. Will you take it to the Banshee, king? The king turned grave as a goat. I wouldn't touch that thing in your pocket, good friends we are, to save your life, Darby. Not for £100 neither. It might give them power over me, you see. Yours is the only mortal hand that ever touched the Banshee's comb, and yours is the hand that should restore it. Oh my, look at that now, says Darby in despair, nodding his head very solemn. Besides, says the king, without noticing, there's only one ghost in Crogma I associate with, and that's Shaun. They're mostly uncultivated down there, and almost, I'd almost say, redundant. Although I'd hate to call anyone redundant unless I had to, says the just-minded old man. Well, then I'll just throw it here in the road and let some of them find it, says Darby, desperate. I'll take the chance. The king was shocked, and throwing up a warning hand, he said, Be no manner of means, Darby O'Gill. You forget that them ghosts are once men and women like yourselves. So when gold concern are about, they're not to be trusted. If one should find the comb, he mightn't give it to the Banshee at all. He mightn't turn bezzler and buzzle it. No. You must give it to herself personal, or else you and Bridget and the children will be haunted all your days, and there's no time to lose either, says he. But Bridget and the children are waiting for me this minute, wailed Darby. And the pony, what's become of her, and me supper? A little lad who was marching just ahead turned round and spoke. Aye, the pony's tied up in the stable, and Bothered Bill has gone sneaking off to the McCloskeys, the little man says. I saw them as I flew past. Phaedrig, shouted the king. Donald, Con, Neil, Phelim, he called. With that, the little men name rose up from the ranks, their cloaks spread, and they come flying back like big green butterflies, and they stopped hovering in the air above Darby and the king. What's wanted? Asked Phelim. Does any of you know where the Banshees do at this hour? The king replied. Yeah. She's due in County Roscommon at Castle O'Flynn, if I don't misremember, spoke the little fiddler. But I think in that since Halloween she ain't working much, and perhaps she won't leave Crogmore. Oh, well, has any one of you seen Shaun the night? I don't know, asked the master. Sorrow one of me knows, said Phaedric. Nor I, nor I, nor I, nor I, cried one after the other. Well, yo's go and find the Banshees where the Banshees stay, and all y'all go. And some of yous, excepting Phaedric, go look for Shaun, and tell him that I want to see him particular, says the king. The 5 hovering little lads vanished like a candle that's been blown out. As for you, Phaedric, went on the master fairy, you tell the regiment they're to guard this town in this night, and keep the ghost out of it. Begin at once. Now the words weren't well said till the whole regiment had blown itself out, and again the night closed in as black as a hat. But as it did, Darby caught a glimpse from afar of the golden light of his own open door, and he thought he could see on the threshold the shadow of Bridget, with one of the children clinging to her skirt, and herself watching with a hand shading her eyes. Oh, do you go home to your supper now, me poor man, says the king. And meantime I'll engage Shaun to guide us to the Banshee. He's a great comrade of hers, don't you know? And he'll pacificate her very well can. Now, the idea of becoming acquainted personal with the ghosts and in a friendly, pleasant way having dealings with them was a new sensation at Darby. Oh, what'll I do now? Oh, you go home to your supper, says the king, and you meet me by the withered tree at Conroy's crossroads at the stroke of 12. There'll be little danger tonight, I'm thinking, but if you should run up against one of them spalpeens, throw the bit of comb at him, maybe he'll take it to the Banshee, maybe he won't. At any rate, it's the best you can do. Oh, don't you keep me waiting at the crossroads now, whatever else happens, warned Darby. I'll do my best endeavour, says the king, but be sure to recognise me when I come. Make no mistake, for you'll have to speak first, he says. They were walking along all this time, and now the lad had come to Darby's own stile. The lad could see the heads of the children bunched up against the window pane. The king stopped, and laying a hand on Darby's arm, spoke up impressive. Aye, if I come to the crossroads as a cow with a rope about me horns, you'll lead me. If I come as a horse with a saddle on me back, you'll ride me, all right? But if I come as a pig with a rope tied to me left hind leg, you drive me, says the king. Oh my, tale and ages, says Darby. But, says the king, waving his hand against interruptions, so that we'll know each other, we'll have a byword betwixt us, and it'll be poetry, he says. So that I'll know 'tis you that's in it, and you'll say, cabbage and bacon, and so that you'll know that it's me that's in it, I'll answer, will stop the heart aching. Cabbage and bacon will stop the heart aching, says the king, growing invisible. That's good, satisfying poetry, he says. But the last words were sounded out of the empty air and a little way above, for the master of the night time had vanished. At that, Darby went into his supper. Now, I won't expatiate to your honour on how our hero spent the evening at home, or how after Bridget and the children were in bed, that a growing desire to meet and talk sociable with a ghost brought with 20 black fears and almost beat them. But whenever his mind hesitated, as it always did, at the thought of the coast of Bower, a finger poked into his waistcoat pocket where the broken bit of comb lay hid and turned the scale. However, at length and at last, just before midnight, our hero, dressed once more for the road, went splashing and plodding up the lane toward Conroy's crossroads. Now, a man is never so brave as when sitting ferninst his own comfortable fire. A hot supper asleep in his chest, a steaming noggin, a flagrant punch in his fist, and a well-tried pipe betwixt his teeth. At such times he ruminates on the old ancient heroes, and he decides there were no great shakes after all. They had the chance to show themselves, and that's the only difference betwixt himself and themselves. But when he's flung sudden out of unpleasant circumstances, as Darby was, to go charging around in the darkness, hunting unknown and invisible dangers, much of that courage oozes out of him, doesn't it? And so the strangest of all things was that this night, when 'twas his fortune to be taken up to the coast of Bower, that the dread of the death coach was present in his mind for the minute he shut the door on himself. It outweighed all the other fears. Now, in spite of the insurance that King Brian had given, in spite of the knowledge that his friends, the good people, were flying hither and thither over that town, and there crept into his soul and fastened itself there the chance that the headless driver might slip past them all and gobble him up. In vain, Darby told himself there were a million spots in Ireland where the death carriage was more likely to be than his own path. But in spite of all reasons, a dread and shivering feeling was in his bones. And so as Darby splashed along, he was flinging anxious looks behind or trembling at the black wavering shadows in front. Howsoever, there was some comfort in knowing that the weather was changing for the better. Strong winds had swept the worst of the storm out over the ocean. There it lingered slow, growling and sputtering a wee bit of lightning. A few scattered frowning clouds, throwing ugly looks at the moon, sulked behind. "Oh, Lord love your shining face," said Darby, looking up to where the full moon, as big as the bottom of a tub, shone bright and clear over his head. "And it's I that hopes that the blackguard of a cloud I see creeping over at you from Slieve the Mon won't reach you and squinch your light up before I meet up with Brian Connors." Now the moon in answer brushed a cloud from her face and shed a clearer, fuller light that made the flooded fields and dropped trees quiver and glisten. On top of the little mound known as Conroy's Hill, and which is just this side of where the Crows cross, the friends of the fairies looked about over the lonesome countryside. Here and there gleamed a distant farmhouse, a still white speck in the moonlight. Only at Con Kelly's, which was a good mile down the road, was a friendly spark of light to be seen, and that spark was so dim, was so far, that it only pressed down the loneliness heavier on Darby's heart. "Oh, wisha," says Darby. "How much I'd rather be there, Mary, making with the boys and the girls, and standing here lonesome and cold, waiting for the devil knows what." Darby strained his eyes to the sight of a horse, or a cow, or a pig, or anything that might turn out to be Brian Connors. The only thing that moved was a huge dark cloud that stretched up from Slieve na Mon, and its heavy edge already touched the rim of the moon. So Darby started down the hill. The withered tree at the crossroads where he was to meet the king waved its blackened arms and lifted them up in warning as he came toward it, and it dripped cold tears upon his caubeen and down his neck when he stood quaking in its shadows. "Oh, if the headless coach were to catch me here," he whimpered, "and fling me into his carriage, not a soul on earth would ever know what become of me." "I wish I wasn't so knowledgeable," Darby says, half crying. "I wish I was as ignorant about ghosts and fairies as little Mrs. Bradigan, who laughs at them. The more you know, the more you need know. Oh, musha, musha, there goes the moon." And at them words, the great blackguard moon and cloud closed in on the moon and left the world as black as a hat. That wasn't the worst of by no manner of means. But at the same instant there came a crash of wind, and with a low rumble froze the marrow in Darby's bones. He strained his eyes toward the sound. It was so dark he couldn't see his hand before his face. He tried to run, but his legs turned to blocks of wood and defied him. All the time the rumble of the terrible coach drew nearer and nearer, and he felt himself helpless as a babe. He closed his eyes to shut the horrors of the headless driver out and of the poor dead men laying back against the seat. At that last minute, a swift hope that the king might be within hearing sent him a flash of strength, and he called out the byword. "Cabbage and bacon!" he cried out despairingly. "Cabbage and bacon will stop the heart aching!" He roared dismally, and then he gave a great gasp. There was a splash of the road ferninst, the three, and a tremendous black coach and 4 giant horses, and the coachman up in the box stood still as death before him. The driver wore a brown greatcoat. The lines hung limp in his fingers, and Darby's grate stopped palpitating at the sight of the two broad, headless shoulders. The knowledgeable man strove out to cry out again, and he only croaked like a raven. "Cabbage and bacon'll stop the heart aching. Cabbage and bacon'll stop the heart aching," Darby says. Something moved inside the coach. "Oh, you foolish man! You've not only given the byword, but at the same time you shouted out its answer." At the voice of the king, for 'twas King Brian Connors it was, a great weakness came over Darby, and he leaned limp against the tree. "Suppose," the king went on, "that it was an enemy who'd met up instead of a friend tearing hounds. He'd have your secret and maybe just put the come hither on ye. Shaun," he says up to the driver, "this is the human being we're to take with us down to Crogmaw to meet the Banshee." Now, from a place down on the seat on the far side of the driver, a deep, slow voice that sounded as though it had fur on it spoke up. "I'm glad to substantiate any service that will in any way conduce to the amelioration of any friend of the renowned King Brian Connors, even though that friend be only a human being. I was a humble human being myself 300 or 400 years ago." At that statement, Darby, out of politeness, tried to look surprised. "You must be a duke or an earl or some other rich philosopher to have the most renowned fairy in the world to take such a shine to you," went on the head that was sitting on the seat. Do you mind? As Rick guessed it. "Well, haven't you seen enough to make yourself like him?" said the king, raising half his body through the open window. Didn't you mark how calm and bold he stood waiting for you, when any other man in Ireland would be this time have wore his legs to the knees for running from you? Where's the philosopher except Darby O'Gill, who would have guessed that 'twas myself that was in the coach and would have flung me the byword so careless and handy? Cried the king, with his face blazing with admiration. The words put the pride into the heart of our hero, and pride the world over is the twin sister of courage. And then, too, whilst the king was talking, deep and obstreperous cloud which had covered the sky slipped off the edge of the moon, hard to join its fellows who were waiting for it out over the ocean. And the moon, to make amends for its late obscuration, showered down a sudden flood of cheerful silver light, and the drooping separate leaves and glistening blades of grass leapt up, clean and laughing to the eye. Some of that cheer went into Darby's breast, and with that crept back fresh his old confidence in his champion, the king. But the headless driver was talking. "O'Gill," says the voice, slow again. "Did I hear you say O'Gill, Brian Connors? Surely not one of the O'Gills from Ballintubber." Now Darby answered reluctant and haughty, for he had a feeling that the monster was going to claim relationship, and the idea put a bad taste in his mouth. "Or me father's people came from Ballintubber," he says. "Well, come this or come that," says the deep voice, coming again from the head on the seat beside the headless driver, and trembling with excitement. "I'll have one look at ye." No sooner said than done, for at that saying the coachman twisted, and picking up an extraordinarily big head from the seat beside him, he held it up in his two hands and faced it to the road. 'Twas the face of a giant, it was. The lad marked that its wiry red whiskers grew close under its eyes, and the flaming hair of the head curled and rolled down to where the shoulders should have been, and he saw too that the nose was wide and the eyes were little, an uglier face you couldn't have wished to observe. But as he looked, the boy saw the great lips tighten and grow wide, and the eyelids half closed, and the head gave a hoarse sob, and the tears trickled down its nose. The head was crying. First Darby grew uncomfortable like. And when he felt himself insulted to be cried at that way by a total stranger, and as the tears rolled faster and faster, and the sobs came louder and louder, and the ugly eyes kept leering at him affectionate, he grew hot with indignation. Seeing which, the head spoke up, snivelling. "No, please, don't get pugnacious. Oh, no, yet disputatious," it begged between sobs. "'Tisn't your face that hurts me and makes me cry. Oh, no, I've seen worse, a great deal worse, many's the time, but what is the amazing family resemblance that paid the Ryan my heart, Mr. O'Gill?" The driver lifted the tail of his coat and wiped the head's two weeping eyes. "'Twas in Ballintubber I was born, in Ballintubber I was reared, and it's there I came to the misfortune through love of a purty fair maid named Margaret Ellen O'Gill. Oh, there was a song about it," he says. "Oh, I've heard it many a time," says the king, nodding, sympathizing, "though not for the last 100 years or so." Darby glared scornful at the king. Vo, wailed the head. "But if you like her, it wasn't for her bunchy red hair, and for the big brown wind it was on her forehead. You'd be as like as two peas in a pod." "Arrah," says Darby, brusting, "I'm ashamed to see a man of your sense on a station," he says, "and high dictation." "You leave off," broke in the king, pulling Darby by the sleeve. "You come inside. Whatever else you do, respect the sentimentalities. They're all we have to live for, ghost or mortal," says he. And so, grumbling, Darby took a place within the coach beside his friend. He filled his pipe, and he was borrowing a bit of fire from that of the king, when, looking up, he saw just back of the driver's seat and opening into the carriage a square hole of about the height and width of two of your hands. And set again the hole, staring affectionate down at him, was the head, and it smiling languaging like. "Oi, well, be this and be that," Darby growled back low to the king. "If he don't take his face out of that window, ghost or no ghost, I'll take a poke at him." "By no manner of means, will you?" says the king, anxious. What do we do without him? We'll be at Crogmore in a few minutes, and then we needn't bother you." "Oh, well, why don't we drive on then?" says Darby, looking up at the surly head. "Why don't you start?" "We've been going these last 3 minutes," smiled Shaun. "We're coming up to Kilmartin churchyard now." "Oh, see, Shaun, lad, have you passed Tom Grogan's public house yet?" asked the king, started up anxious. "I have, but I can turn back again," says the face, lighting up interested like. "Oh, well, "I think keep the best whisky there in this part of Ireland," says the king. "Would you mind stepping in and bringing us out a sup, Darby O'Gill?" Do I get the feeling that King Brian O'Connor's is related to someone else that remain unnamed in our audience tonight? Mistress Tom Grogan was a tall, irritated woman with sharp corners all over her and a temper that was like an east wind. She was standing at her own door arguing with Garge McKibney and Willem Broderick and dealing them out horrid names, whilst her husband, Tom, a mild little man, stood within Lanel on the bar smoking sedately. Now Garg and Willem were arguing back at Mistress Grogan, telling her what a fine-looking and respectable woman she was, and they couldn't have dropped one more. Couldn't they have just one more drop before going home, when they saw coming sliding along through the air toward them? Aye, they saw coming sliding through the air, about 4 feet above the ground, mind ye, a decent-dressed man, sitting comfortable, his pipe in his mouth, one leg crossed over the other. The stranger stopped in the air not 5 feet away, and in the moonlight they saw him plain knock the ashes from his pipe and stick it in the rim of his carbine. Now, being getting on 8 p.m. and closing time, they thought maybe they would just head off. But they said, we got a few more minutes left. We can tell you the rest of the story, so why don't you stick around for it then? You don't need to leave just yet. And so they catched hold of each other, and gasping as he stepped down out of the air to the ground, and wishing them the top of the evening, he brushed past, and he walked bold to the bar and briskly called for 3 jorums of whisky. Now Tom, oblivious, for he hadn't seen, handed out the drinks, and the stranger, natural as you please, emptied one, wiped his mouth with the back of his hand, and started for the door, carrying the 2 other jorums. Now, Tom, of course, followed out to see who was in the road, and then he clutched hold of the 3 others, and the 4, gripping each other like lobsters boiling in a pot, clung speechless, swagging back and forth. Sure, 'twas no wonder, mind you, for what they saw the strange man lift the 2 cups into the naked air, and then they saw plain the 2 jorums leave the man's hands, Darby O'Gill's hands, mind you, and they saw those 2 jorums tip themselves slowly over until the bottoms were uppermost, not one drop of the liquor spilled into the ground, and they saw no more, for they each gave a different kind of roar when Darby turned to bring back the empty vessels. The next second Tom Grogan was flying like a hunted rabbit over the muddy potato field behind his own stable, was Roland Burrock and Garge McGibney were dashing furious after him like the skipperbeg hounds. But Mrs. Grogan didn't run away because she was on her own threshold, lying flat on her back, and for the first time in her life, speechless. However, with a rumble and roar, the coach with its travellers went away. The good liquor supplied all that last sight lacked that was needful to put our 3 heroes in good humour, and themselves, and with each other, so that it wasn't long before, their troubles being forgot, they were conversing sociable and unfamiliar one with the other. Darby, to improve his information, was striving to make the best of the situation by asking knowledgeable questions. "So, what kind of disposition has a Banshee, I don't know?" he asked after a time. "Oh, well, she's a fine creature. And very refined, and only a bit too fond of crying and wailing for me," says Shaun. "Oh, Shaw," says the knowledgeable man, "I know several living women that kept fits. Sure does she do nothing but wail death keens? Has she had no good love ballads or songs like that? I think she'd grow tired." "Oh, don't you be talking," says Shaun. "'Tis she who can sing them. She has one in particular, the ballad of Mary McGuinness. Oh, that I wish you could hear her at that," he says. "The song has a splendid 3 tunes to it, and the tune changes at every verse. I wished I had it all, but I'll sing you what I have," he says. With that, the head began to sing, in a fine, deep singing voice it had, too, only maybe a little too roaring for love ballads. "Come, all ye true lovers, wherever ye may be, likewise ye disavers by land or by sea. I hope that ye listen with pity to me, since the jewel of me life is a traitor." "Here's where the tune changes," says the head, licking his lips. "I'm going to church last Sunday, my true love passed me by. I knew her mind was changed by the twinkling of her eye. I knew her mind was changed, for she calls for me to moan. With a terrible black misfortune to think she called her grown." "That's what I call real poetry," says Darby. "Why, there's no finer," says the king, standing up on the seat, his face a beaming. "Oh, you wait for the next verse, then you'll cry the salty tears," says Shaun. And he sang very affected. "Oh, dig me a grave, both large, wide, and deep. I'd lay me down gently to take me long sleep. Put a stone at me head and a stone at me feet, since I cannot get Mary McGuinness." Oh, faith, 'tis a fine and pitiful song, says Darby. I'd give a great deal if only I had it, says he. Oh, but sure, who knows, maybe you can get it, says the old king with a wink. You may demand the favours of 3 wishes for bringing her what you're bringing her, he whispered. Shaun, Shaun, he says out loud, do you think the Banshee'll give that song for bringing back the lost comb? I don't know. Well, I don't know myself, says the head dubious. Because if she would, here's the man whose comb has the comb, and he's bringing it back to her. At this the head gave a start, and its eyes bulged with gladness. Oh, that's a lucky man I am entirely then, says the head, for she promised to stick me head on and let me wear it permanent like if only I'd bring tidings of the comb, says Shaun. She's been in a bad way since she lost it. You know that creature can sing only when she's combing her hair. Since the comb's broke, her voice is cracked scandalous, and she's bitter ashamed. So she is. But here's Crogmaw right before us. Will yous go in and take a drop of something, says he. Sticking out his head, Darby saw towering up in the night gloom bleak Crogmaw, the mountain of ghosts. And as he thought of the thousands of shivering things inside, and of the unpleasant feelings he'd given him at Charter's Mill a few hours before, a doubt came into Darby's mind as to whether it were best to trust himself inside. Aye, he might never come out. However, the king spoke up, saying, Thank you kindly, Shaun, but you know well that yourself and 1 or 2 others are the only ghosts I associate with. And so we'll just step out and do you go on yourself and tell all the Banshees, tell the Banshees that we're awaiting out here, right? You return with your Shaun, for you must take Darby back. With that, the 2 heroes descended from the coach, and glad enough was Darby to put his brogue safe and sound on the road again. Now all at once the side of the mountain ferninst opened with a great crash, and Shaun with the coach and horses disappeared in a rush, and were swallowed up by that mountain, which closed after him. Darby was blinking and shivering beside the king, when sudden, and without a sound, the Banshee stood before them. Aye, she was all in white, and her yellow hair streeled to the ground, and the weight of sorrow and ages were on her pale face. Is that you, Brian Connors? She says. And is that the one with you, the man who grabbed me? You're most obedient, says the king, bowing low. And it was an accident, says he. Oh, accident or no accident, the Banshee says, severe-like. 'Tis a fine lot of trouble he's caused me. And 'tis the elegant lot of trouble we'd had this night if you hadn't saved him, she says. The Banshee spoke in a hollow voice, which once in a while did break into a squeak. Will you let bygones be bygones, ma'am, if you please, says Darby. I no brought you back your comb, and by your leave I asked the favour of 3 wishes. Now, some way or other, he wasn't so afeard now that the king was near, and besides, one square, cool look at any kind of trouble, even 'tis a ghost, takes half the dread from it, don't it? I have only 2 favours to grant any mortal man, says she, and here they are. With that, she handed Darby 2 small black stones with things carved on them. The first stone will make you invisible if you rub the front of it, and 'twill make you visible again if you rub the back of it. Then put the other stone in your mouth, and you can mount and ride the wind, so Shaun needn't drive yous back, she says. The king's face beamed with joy. Oh, by the hokey, Darby, me lad, think of the larks we'll have travelling nights together over Ireland ground, and maybe we'll go across the sea. But fairies can't cross running water, says Darby, wondering. Oh, that's all superstition, says the king. Didn't I cross the River Ryan? But, ma'am, says he, you have a 3rd favour, and one I'm wishing for mightily myself, and that is that you'll teach us the ballad of Mary McGuinness. The Banshee blushed. Oh, I have a cold, she says. 'Tis the way with singers, says the king, winking at Darby. But we'll thank you to do your best, ma'am. Well, the Banshee took out her comb, and fastened it to the broken end, she passed it through her hair a few times and began the song. At first her voice was pretty weak and trembling like, but the more she combed, the stronger it grew, till at last it rose high and clear, and sweet and wild, as Darby'd heard it that Halloween night up at the McCarthy's. Now the 2 heroes stood in the shadow of a tree, Darby listening and the king busy writing down the song. At the last word, the place where she had been standing flashed empty, and Darby never saw the Banshee again. No, I wished I had all the song to let you hear it, and maybe one day I'll be learning it from Darby myself, and by the next time perhaps we meet. And I wish I had time to tell you now how Darby one day had made himself invisible and lost the stone, and how bothered Bill Donahue had found it, and how Bill, rubbing it by accident, made himself invisible at the terrible time Darby had finding him. But I think we've gone too long tonight already anyway. So that's the conclusion of our story of the Banshees' Comb. Aye, the Banshees' Halloween, as it were. And I do hope you've enjoyed our tale tonight.